Broadcasting from the basement of La Penta, it's WICR.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Sports Vault Jersey. Joe Archino back here. And yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War. And in 2015, I think when we look back at it over those 50 years, the Vietnam War is the war that changed the way all future wars would be fought, especially in the regards to the United States of America. And I think it was the first time that we ever really saw us trying to throw everything that we had at an enemy and the enemy not fighting it on our terms. It's one of those things where we saw a shift away from the conventional armies meeting each other on the battlefield, waving flags. It was ugly, it was brutal, it was a guerrilla-based conflict, and it was something that we've seen mimicked, the strategy against the United States forces, for all future generations. Now, we have not seen a conventional military take the field against our own military since the Vietnam War. And while the North Vietnamese certainly had a formidable army in regards to the way that they were set up and structured, the Viet Cong, which were more the guerrilla forces, kind of, as well as the North Vietnamese, denied us the ability to fight the war on our own terms. It was something where they made the war, us come to them. And certainly that's a strategy we have seen implemented through terrorist organizations that we fought in, through the war on terror that we're currently fighting now. And it's something that makes the climate for the military so much more dangerous today. But I think you have to look at the Vietnam War in regards to just what the significance it made on the world, because it's easily the most controversial war the United States has ever been a part of. Still, people to this day don't understand why we were involved in that conflict. And for somebody like me who didn't live through the conflict but certainly has learned and lived through it through film and through history books and through classrooms, I think what I think of it is we went into the war for the right reasons, but we didn't really understand what we were doing there once we got there. And the leaders who were supposed to be the ones who were paving the way there did a terrible job. And, normally this is a sports talk show, and we always talk about how much leadership really means in sports. And it's even more so in the military. If you don't have people leading you the right way, you're not going to accomplish the mission. I think more than anything, our fundamental strategy in Vietnam was wrong. And again, we were there for the right reasons. No one should have to live under communism. Communism is as horrible a living condition and an ordeal that anyone could ever have to be put through. It violates every basic principle that every civilization has ever tried to pursue in terms of freedom. And we were there to make sure that the South Vietnamese didn't have to endure that, to make sure that freedom was something accessible to everyone. So we were there for the right reasons, but we fought it the wrong way, and because of that, we had to abandon the mission, which is something we started and we should have finished. And we could have finished the mission, but political instability, the country turned their back against the army, which I think is one of the saddest moments in our history. I mean, you just hear veteran stories about them coming back, wearing their uniforms, people throwing things at them, people treating them like they were the enemy. It's one of the saddest times in American history when Americans turn their backs on the soldiers who went over there just doing their mission, doing something that their leaders told them to do. And that's really where Vietnam was lost, in leadership in the White House, leadership among the military commanders, because where we tried to accomplish the mission in Vietnam was in terms of body count. The goal of the United States military during that time was to measure success in terms of body count. The amount of NVA, and when I say NVA, I mean North Vietnamese, which was the main army we were fighting, and then the Viet Cong. Body count was how we tried to measure success. But if you learn about warfare and you learn about the history of war, you know success is not determined in body count. It's determined by winning the hearts and minds of the people you're trying to defend and holding on to land. Land is really what was lost in the Vietnam War, because what we would do is we would send our soldiers in, they would kill all the enemy soldiers, and then they'd pack up and go back to their bases. And during that time when they left, the enemy would just reclaim this territory that they had just fallen for. I mean, and it's so frustrating to the veterans when you hear them talk in stories where there's a battle called Hamburger Hill. There's a movie about it. I'm sure a lot of people have seen it. Very difficult battle. A lot of Americans lost their lives. It was so hard fought to get that hill. And then the U.S. takes the hill, and then they have to abandon the hill right away. And once they abandon the hill, what happens? The enemy just takes the hill once again. And that really kind of is the epitome of the Vietnam War is you kill the enemy, you take land for a short amount of time, and then you pack up and you go home. And that was just the incorrect way to fight that war. The U.S. tried to do everything their way without trying to look at it in the grand scheme of things, and it didn't work. And if we had the right leaders in place during that time, the war would have had a very different outcome, but it did not. And now it's all only something that we can look back in the history books as one of the biggest failures of the United States in United States history. I mean, you don't go somewhere with a mission and then not complete it. You don't devote that many resources, lose that many lives, make promises to people, and then just turn your backs on them. That's not the American way. That's not what we have stood for. And I think, again, it's just the sad history of the Vietnam War. It's something where victory was obtainable. Even with all the problems that we had, victory was obtainable. Because like I said before, even though the enemy didn't fight us on our own terms, there were times where they did try to take the fight to us. And when that happened, it just wielded disastrous consequences. I think the biggest thing that most people probably remember from the Vietnam War, probably the biggest conflict that got the most media recognition, that started to turn more people against the war than anything, was the Tet Offensive. And for people who don't know, it's the Tet Lunar New Year. It's kind of like New Year's here for the Vietnamese. And during that time, there was supposed to be a ceasefire. It was supposed to be a time to celebrate with loved ones. But the our enemies during that time, the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, they launched surprise attacks, and they wielded very, very quick temporary victories where they were taking a lot of places, putting a lot of losses on the South Vietnamese forces who were allied with us at that time. And they did have a great deal of immediate success, but then right away, as the U.S. forces started to remobilize, they started to regain all these places. And during that time, the NVA, our enemies again, they used about 80,000 fighters to try during that offensive. And they lost half their forces once we started to reorganize and we started to take the fight back to them. So they launched the offensive with about 84,000 fighters, and they lost about 40,000. The Viet Cong, who again were the more guerrilla type fighters, they suffered such heavy losses that they never really even regained their combat effectiveness during the rest of the war. And I think cases like that just show you, if the U.S. had just kind of done something where they just provided security and they just tried to build infrastructure and provide security protection for South Vietnam, and they made the NVA and the South Viet Cong come to them and attack them, I think you've seen in examples like Tet that victory would have been obtainable, because we pursued them instead of when they pursued us. And when they pursued the United States and the South Vietnamese army, it always wielded incredibly just overwhelming signs of victory for the U.S. and for their allies, but that was just not the way that the war was fought. And now, with 50 years kind of the mark hitting as of yesterday, I think all we have left is history. And if there's anything history teaches us, it's that you can learn from it, and I think we have learned to an extent from it, but war was changed forever by Vietnam. It just changed the way that we will see wars fought for the rest of human history. The premises of war will always be different, but the fundamental ways that it is fought will always be the same. And I think more than anything, when we look back at Vietnam, it's something where you never can forget, because those mistakes that were made can happen again, and then you have to always remember how the mistakes happen and never make them again. And it really all comes down to leadership. But the 50th anniversary, keep all the veterans in your prayers, keep all the people who died in our country during that conflict in your prayers, and I'll never forget, because I think the way that we can always honor is by never forgetting. And more than anything, the veterans of the Vietnam War, the ones who lost their lives and the ones who are still unaccounted for, always deserve to be in our memory, because they fought in a war that they didn't totally understand, that our country didn't totally understand. I think more than anything, they always deserve to be honored in our memory, like any veteran who's ever fought for this country does. But until then, Joe Archino here with the Sports Vault. I'll see you folks next time.